My name is Kwabena. Welcome. I want to share with you Africa, the Industrial Revolution, technology, and the world history. How, as Africans, how we've been taught the world history, and how we've been taught how the world has developed over the years. If you search on the internet, particularly on materials that would have to do with technology, engineering, development, very little you will find on Africa. A lot of it you will find that will be on Africa will be something that has to do with things that are negative. Even in our lifetime that we are, now that we are alive, if anything happens around the world, if it's good news, and these guys, they will not say it. But if it's anything bad about Africa, it will become news. So how about those that happened that we were not there? How about those that happened that they took control over? So they could tell the story always in their favor and a lot of the times against us. So you see that a lot of Africans have no that much deep sense of history. So let's say we want to backtrack for the last 10,000 years or 7,000 years or 6,000 years. A lot of us have no memory at all. A lot of Africans, a lot of black people have no memory at all. As a matter of fact, a lot of the world's population are not interested in things like that. And yet these are the tools that anybody will use to condition a whole group of people to the advantage. So I would want to share briefly with you, because sometimes some people think that the world has changed and the world has developed for the last 1,000 years, and it is not necessarily so. Let's assume for the last 2,000 years, after the death of Christ, if that is the reference point, what has gone through the world. And if you want to talk about the history of the world, you can, the way they have carved it is more in the Western kind of history. Maybe the Chinese have theirs, but it's not available to a lot of us. Maybe the Africans have theirs, but they are not conscious of it that much. The much of history that we know strictly has been the one through the European eye. So you will hear of Christ, you will hear of the Roman Empire, you will hear of the Renaissance, you will hear of slavery, you will hear of colonization, you will hear of the First World War, the Second World War, you will hear of the things that have happened for the last 100 years. So that is the dominant history that we all have. If you ask the African anything beyond that, they will not know, because maybe we have not studied it. But the little studies that I've done prove that Africa is not that much disadvantaged when it comes to development. When it comes to development, we are not that much disadvantaged. If you look at the time that the Europeans came, maybe in the 15th century, from there up to maybe the 17th century or so, or the 18th century or so, much of Africa, was compressed and was under threat and was under survival. We were trying to survive. If you look at the time that they say that the so-called Industrial Revolution started, which they are saying is from 1760 thereabout to 1820, 1830, 1840, the first Industrial Revolution. Because now when they talk about the world history, everybody uses the Europeans as the standard, as the reference point. So if you strictly go by that, the first industrialization or the revolution, once it started, they had done slavery for at least 300 years. So I think that it's not just it so happened that they were so much intelligent that they started to come up with the steam engine because all civilizations had a way of, had the understanding of technology that they were using, whether for light or for energy or for how they survive. So when they talk about steam engine, and as the start of industrialization, I think the start of industrialization is when they started to capture the Africans and put them into massive labor, because that was an industry, that was providing work, so there were a lot of production that happened maybe 250 years, 300 years before the so-called first industrial revolution. So a lot of it, the money that they took, the people, the Africans that they took to Europe, to America, they contributed hugely to the so-called industrial revolution, the first one, and the intellectual properties that they had. But you see, if you read, if you search, a lot of it has been the data is very silent on the contribution of Africans on any of those. Whether it's on the continent itself, or whether it's in England, Europe, or whether it's in Americas. Anywhere, it's more of they are projecting only the European sense, because much of history has been carved that way from the Western or from European sense of superiority, to tell us that they are the only ones who understood and nobody has understood anything. So that is what they have told us. But the first industrial revolution, as we would want to call it, as they have told us, which I think is not like that is the first. And this could be the first. It was more about the steam engine. It was more about the mechanization. They tried to find a way to mechanize farming, to make sure that they were using machines, because then they were trying to do away with the slave labor, which was not basically sustainable. So once it was not sustainable, and the slaves, as they call them, had been working for the last 300 years or so. So you could imagine the kind of input that they may have come up with, the kind of techniques that they may have come up with. So if much of this came from the very industries that they were involved, then your guess is as good as mine. So a lot of it, they started under the first industrial revolution, started with agriculture, mechanization, the coal, as they call it. Now the second one, and much of it, the first one, much of it led into the establishment of rail lines, and mainly rail lines were built by who? By the Africans. So a lot of it that as if the Africans and black people around the world have never done anything. The only thing is that you have to find out yourself. You have to go and read yourself and research yourself, because a lot of Africans don't know much of this. The second revolution, as they say, industrial revolution, happened around the 1870 thereabout, and it had to do more with coming up with electricity, coming up with gas, coming up with anything that had to do with energy, oil, and it got into much of the 19th century or so, at the end of the 19th century. The other thing that you will see is that they started to develop steel, and a lot of chemicals, and then they started to come out with this telephone things, communication. That was at the end of the second revolution. Then now they say there is a third one. There's a third one, and that third one is where a lot is the one that has to do with electronics and computers and advancement in telecommunication. So in all this, what you see is that you can find the Africans as a movement, as a people who have been part of any of these, whether it's the first one, the second one, or even the third one. Not because we were not intelligent, not because we could not do anything for ourselves, but it's because a lot of the promoters of science and of technology at the same time were trying heavily to undermine the efforts that the Africans could bring. And don't forget, just within that same period that they started to also session Africa into their colonies, you know. So the Gold Coast, for instance, was between 1867 or so to 1957. So that the time that a lot of these so-called revolutions were happening, those were the very times that they were also busily trying to session Africa and colonizers and trying to attack all the kingdoms that could also become anything. So proud to this, these African countries that we see now were not even countries. You know, so Ghana was not there. Ghana was probably called Gold Coast. We don't even know the boundaries. It was not this current Ghana. So if you're saying that, why couldn't we industrialize at that time? We were not even a nation. You know, we were not even a nation as Ghana, or Nigeria was not like that, or Kenya or South Africa. All of us were just living in our spots, and we had colonial rulers over us. So we were not together, and we didn't have plan as a people, as a country, to develop. So much of the so-called development happened at the time. The revolutions happened at the time that African countries were not even countries, you know, and our kingdoms were not even allowed to run. So the fourth revolution that they call the internet, and all these Africans as individuals have played major part. We have had a lot of engineers, scientists, mathematicians who have been part of all discipline of technology and of technological advancement. The other thing that you should also know is that innovation can happen at the individual levels as well, but mass production after any innovation has come into existence were carved from companies. And a lot of these, you know, for instance, the African Americans, a lot of them were not even allowed to own companies.